There is a sound that belongs to the 1920s, and it is not the one you might expect. It is not the wail of a saxophone, or the rattle of a Tommy gun, or the cheer of a crowded dance floor. It is quieter than all of that. It is the soft, secretive trickle of liquid being poured in the dark, into a glass, into a bottle, into a flask tucked against someone's ribs, and the careful hush of people who have agreed, without ever quite saying so, to share a small and pleasant crime. For 13 years, that sound was the heartbeat of a nation that had officially sworn off drinking and quietly kept right on doing it. From the winter of 1920 to the winter of 1933, the United States of America lived a strange double life. On paper, it was dry. In its cellars and its bathtubs, on its coastlines and its country roads, in the back rooms of its barber shops and the basements of its brownstones, it was as wet as it had ever been. Wetter, perhaps, because forbidden things have a way of becoming more interesting than they ever were when they were allowed. And standing in the middle of that contradiction, doing the work that kept the whole improbable arrangement running, was a figure we have wrapped in so much myth and movie glamour that we have almost forgotten he was a real person with cold hands and tired feet and a family at home and a very particular set of fears. The bootlegger, the rum-runner, the moonshiner, the wheelman, the speakeasy owner, the chemist mixing poison into something that smelled like gin. Tonight, I want to take you back into their world, not the polished, pinstriped version you've seen on screen, but the actual texture of it. The cold and the boredom and the terror and the small, absurd comedies of it. What it was really like, day after day and night after night, to make your living breaking a law that almost nobody actually believed in. So settle in, get comfortable, or let the room go quiet around you. And before we slip back across that century and into the long shadows of Prohibition, let me ask one small thing of you. If you find some pleasure in these journeys we take together, these slow wanderings through the forgotten corners of history, take just a moment to subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps more than you might think, and it means we get to keep doing this, you and I, night after night. And while you're at it, I'd love it if you left a comment letting me know two things: where in the world you happen to be listening from, and what time it is for you right now, in this very moment. I find it quietly wonderful to imagine all of us, scattered across the globe, in all our different hours, drifting through the same old story together. Some of you in the deep middle of the night, some of you watching the light change at the edge of evening, all of us here in the dark together now. Let us begin where it all began, not with the crime, but with the silence that came before it. To understand the bootlegger, you first have to understand the thirst he was built to satisfy, and the strange, sweeping, deeply earnest movement that tried to take that thirst away. Americans, it has to be said, drank an astonishing amount. In the early decades of the 19th century, before any of this began, the average American adult put away something close to 7 gallons of pure alcohol a year, a figure that would stagger a modern drinker. Whiskey was cheaper than coffee, cheaper than milk, cheaper sometimes than the water, which in many towns was not safe to drink at all. Men drank at breakfast. They drank at the midday break, when the jug was passed around the field or the workshop floor. Laborers were sometimes paid partly in liquor. It was woven into the fabric of ordinary life so completely that to be against it seemed almost like being against weather. But all that drinking left wreckage behind it, and the people who lived nearest to the wreckage began slowly to organize. They were, in the beginning, mostly women, women who had watched husbands drink away the rent, watched fathers come home with their fists already swinging, watched the wages of a hard week's work vanish across a saloon counter on a Friday night while children went hungry at home. For these women, who in most of the country could not yet vote, and could not easily divorce, and could not own property in their own names, the saloon was not a charming institution. It was the enemy. It was the place that swallowed the men they depended on and spat back something cruel. And so the temperance movement was born, and it grew, and it gathered to itself an extraordinary coalition. There were the church congregations who saw drink as a moral rot. There were the progressive reformers who saw it as a social disease to be cured like cholera. There were the suffragists who tied the cause of votes for women to the cause of a sober nation. There were even, strangely, the great industrialists, men like Henry Ford and John D. Rockefeller, who poured money into the dry cause because a sober worker was a punctual worker, a safe worker, a worker who showed up Monday morning able to operate the new and dangerous machinery without losing a hand. At the center of it all stood the Anti-Saloon League, perhaps the most effective single-issue pressure group the country had ever produced. They did not much care whether a politician was otherwise good or bad, honest or corrupt, brilliant or dull. They cared about one thing. Was he wet or was he dry? Vote our way, and we will deliver you the church vote on Sunday. Cross us, and we will end you. It was ruthless, focused, and it worked. State by state, county by county, the map of America began to dry out, like a tide going slowly out across the whole continent. Then came the Great War, and the war handed the dry forces gifts they could scarcely have imagined. Grain was needed for bread, not booze. It felt almost unpatriotic to distill whiskey, while soldiers needed feeding. And the great brewing families of America, the Bushs and the Popsts and the Schlitzes, bore German names at exactly the moment when anything German had become an object of suspicion and hatred. The brewer, the drink, the saloon, all of it was tarred, fairly or not, as foreign, as disloyal, as a thing decent Americans should turn their backs on. And so, in the dry, cold winter at the close of that decade, the impossible became real. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, an amendment forbidding the manufacture, sale, and transportations of intoxicating liquors, was ratified by the states. It joined the founding document of the Republic, sitting there beside the freedom of speech and the right to a fair trial, a constitutional command that the American people should stop drinking. And to give that command its teeth, Congress passed the National Prohibition Act, which everyone came to call the Volstead Act, after the mild, bespectacled Minnesota congressman whose name was attached to it. The Volstead Act drew the line with a precision that would shape everything that followed. Intoxicating liquor, it declared, was any beverage containing more than 1/2 of 1% of alcohol. 0.5%? That was the threshold. Below it, you were a citizen. Above it, you were a criminal. The clock began to tick toward midnight on the 16th of January, 1920, and a country that had never in its history gone a single day without a drink prepared with a kind of stunned disbelief to go dry forever. It would not, of course, go dry at all, but nobody knew that yet. Or rather, some people knew it perfectly well and were already quietly getting ready. Picture the final hours, the night of January 16th, drifting toward the 17th in the year 1920. In the great cities, the bars and hotels and restaurants threw the wildest farewell parties anyone had seen. There were mock funerals, with black draped coffins carried solemnly through dining rooms, while a band played a dirge and grown men dabbed at their eyes, half laughing, half not. In the finest hotels, waiters in white gloves brought out the last legal champagne, and the corks flew, and the orchestras played until the small hours, and everyone drank as though they meant to lay down enough memory of it to last them the rest of their lives. But the truly clever people were not at the parties. The truly clever people were in their cellars and their warehouses doing arithmetic, because the law, as written, contained a loophole wide enough to drive a delivery truck through, and many, many delivery trucks were about to be driven through it. It was not, you see, illegal to drink. The 18th Amendment forbade making, selling, and transporting liquor. It said nothing whatsoever about a man enjoying, in the privacy of his own home, the liquor he already happened to own. And so, in those last legal weeks and days, anyone with money and foresight had been busy stockpiling. The wealthy bought entire cellars worth, crate upon crate, and had it carted home to be walled up behind brick and stored against the long dry years. The Yale Club in New York famously laid in a supply estimated to last its members 14 years, longer, as it turned out, than Prohibition itself would last. So that final night was not really the end of drinking in America. It was simply the night the drinking went underground. At 1 minute past midnight, by the letter of the law, the taps ran dry from coast to coast. The saloons that had stood on every corner went dark, or boarded up, or hung out new signs claiming to be soda fountains and lunch counters and social clubs. A vast and thirsty machine fell silent, and into that silence stepped a new kind of man, because the moment a thing that millions of people want becomes illegal, you have not eliminated the want. You have only changed who profits from it. Overnight, the most ordinary commodity in American life, a glass of beer, a shot of rye, a bottle of wine for Sunday dinner, became contraband. And contraband, for those willing to take the risk, was worth a fortune. The drought had begun, and so had the flood. We tend to imagine the bootlegger as one specific kind of figure, the sharp-suited gangster, the swaggering crime boss with the diamond ring and the cold eyes. And those men existed, and we will meet some of them. But they were the spectacular exceptions, the visible tip of an enormous and largely invisible iceberg. The truth is that bootlegging, in its first years, was overwhelmingly a trade of ordinary people, and that is what made it impossible to stop. Consider who they were. There was the farmer in the hills of Appalachia, or the Ozarks, who had been making corn whiskey for his family and his neighbors for generations, long before any government in Washington had an opinion about it. To him, the new law was not a moral question at all. It was simply a market opportunity that had fallen from the sky. The corn he grew was worth a few cents a bushel as feed. turned into whiskey. That same corn was worth dollars, real dollars, folding money, the kind that could keep a struggling farm alive through a bad year. He did not feel like a criminal. He felt like a man with a still and a hungry market, and that is exactly what he was. There was the immigrant in the crowded tenements of the eastern cities, the Italian who had pressed his own wine in the old country and saw no reason to stop now, the German who had brewed his own beer, the Eastern European who knew the secrets of the still from a homeland where home distilling was simply a part of life. For these communities, the idea that the government could forbid a family from making the wine for its own table was not just inconvenient, it was bewildering, an offense against everything they understood about how a household worked. There was the out of work saloon keeper, the bartender, the brewery hand, the distillery worker, tens of thousands of people whose entire trade had been declared illegal at the stroke of midnight, who knew the business of liquor intimately, and who had bills to pay and families to feed, and a skill that was suddenly worth more on the black market than it had ever been worth in the open. And there was, perhaps above all, the simple opportunist, the ambitious young man, often the child of immigrants, often shut out of the respectable avenues of advancement by his name or his accent or his religion or the simple fact that he had no money and no connections. For such a man, the legitimate ladder of American success had most of its rungs missing. But bootlegging was a ladder with no gatekeepers at all. It did not care where you came from. It cared only whether you were willing to work hard, take risks, keep your mouth shut, and occasionally do terrible things. For a certain kind of hungry, clever, ruthless young person, it was the great open door, maybe the only open door, and they walked through it in their thousands. What united all of these wildly different people was a single, quietly corrosive fact. A huge majority of the country simply did not believe that drinking was wrong. They might have voted dry in some abstract civic mood, but they did not actually intend to stop drinking themselves, and they did not regard the man who supplied them as a villain. They regarded him as a tradesman performing a useful service, the way you might regard the man who delivers the ice or the coal. And it is very, very hard to enforce a law that the people it governs do not in their hearts believe in. That single fact, that gap between the law on the page and the law in the human heart, is the soil in which the entire world of the bootlegger grew. Everything else followed from it. Let us go first to the source, to the most ancient and elemental form of the trade, to the still in the woods, glowing in the dark. Come with me up into the hills. It is the dead of night, because the work is almost always done at night, and we are deep in a hollow far from any road, somewhere in the folded blue mountains, where the federal government has always been an idea more than a presence. There is a creek nearby, because the still needs cold running water, and the sound of it is the only sound except the soft crackle of the fire and the low, patient drip of the work being done. The still itself is a thing of beautiful, dangerous simplicity. At its heart is the boiler, often a great copper pot, sometimes nothing more than an old oil drum, sealed and set above a fire. Into it goes the mash, a fermented soup of cornmeal, sugar, water, and yeast that has been left to work for days in great barrels, bubbling and souring until it is thick with alcohol and smells, frankly, like something gone wrong. When the fire is lit beneath that mash and the temperature climbs just so, the alcohol, which boils at a lower temperature than water, rises first as vapor before the water ever begins to steam. That vapor is the whole game. It travels up out of the boiler and into a coiled length of copper tubing called the worm, which sits inside a barrel of that cold creek water. And in the cool of the worm, the vapor surrenders, condenses back into liquid, and comes weeping out the far end, drop by precious drop, into the waiting jar. The first liquid to come off the still is called the foreshots, and a moonshiner who knew his craft threw it away because it carried the most volatile and most dangerous compounds, including methanol, wood alcohol, the poison that could blind a man or kill him. After the foreshots came the heads, still harsh, and then at last the heart of the run, the clear, clean, fierce spirit that was the whole reason for the night's labor. The skill of the moonshiner lay precisely in knowing where one stopped and the next began, in reading the temperature, the smell, the very feel of the liquid, and in making cuts by instinct that a modern distillery makes with thermometers and gauges. A good moonshiner produced a product that was strong and clean and surprisingly drinkable. A careless or greedy one produced poison, and there was a great deal of poison because there were a great many careless and greedy people, and because the economics of the trade pushed relentlessly toward cutting corners. Some operators, hungry for higher yields and faster output, used car radiators as condensers in place of proper copper, not knowing or not caring that those radiators were soldered with lead and that the lead leached into every drop of liquor that passed through them. The result was a slow lead poisoning that crippled and killed people who had done nothing more than buy a jar of what they were told was good corn whiskey. Others added God knows what to stretch their product and fake its strength, embalming fuel, industrial chemicals, anything that burned the throat and made the drinker believe the stuff was potent. The pure, careful mountain whiskey of an honest moonshiner and the lethal swill of a back alley faker looked exactly the same in the jar. The drinker had no way to tell them apart until it was far too late. The life of the moonshiner was a life of constant, low-grade dread, punctuated by moments of sharp terror. The work was hard and hot and dangerous in itself. Stills could and did explode, blasting boiling mash and fire across the men tending them. The hours were brutal, the locations remote, the secrecy total. A man might tend his still through the freezing small hours, hauling water and feeding the fire, his clothes soaked and his hands cracked, all the while listening, always listening, for the snap of a twig or the distant note of a revenue agent's car that meant the law had found him. The revenuers, the federal agents charged with hunting down illegal stills, were the great enemy, and the mountain people developed an entire folklore around outwitting them. Stills hidden in caves and disguised in the undergrowth, lookouts posted on the ridgelines, warning systems of bird calls and lantern signals passed from hollow to hollow. It was a war, a quiet, generations-long guerrilla war between the people of the hills and the government of the lowlands, and Prohibition simply poured gasoline on a fire that had been smoldering since the earliest days of the Republic. But for all its danger, moonshining had one quality that made it irresistible to poor and proud people. It required almost nothing to begin. A copper pot, some grain, some sugar, a length of tubing, a creek, and a willingness to risk prison. You did not need capital. You did not need connections. You did not need anyone's permission. In a country where so many doors were closed, the Still in the Woods was a door that any determined man could open for himself. And so they opened it, in their tens of thousands, all across the rural South and the mountain West, and the clear liquid trickled out of the hills and down into the thirsty cities, one jar at a time. If the moonshiners' poison was mostly the product of carelessness and greed, there was another poison loose in the country during those years that was something far stranger and far darker. A poison made on purpose, and not by criminals, but by the government of the United States itself. To understand it, you have to understand the problem the law created. Alcohol, you see, was not only a beverage, it was and is an essential industrial chemical used in the manufacture of everything from paints and solvents to fuels and medicines and cosmetics. Prohibition could not simply ban all alcohol because industry would grind to a halt. So the law allowed industrial alcohol to be produced in enormous quantities, but required that it be denatured, that is, deliberately contaminated with foul tasting, foul smelling additives that would make it unfit to drink, so that no one would be tempted to divert it from the factory to the cocktail glass. But of course, they were tempted, and of course, they diverted it. Bootleggers bought up industrial alcohol by the tanker load and then hired chemists, real chemists with real training, to renature it, to strip out the additives and turn the poisoned industrial spirit back into something that could pass for drinkable liquor. It became one of the largest single sources of illegal alcohol in the entire country. By the middle of the decade, the authorities estimated that a huge fraction of all the liquor consumed in America had begun its life as denatured industrial alcohol. The government's response to this was, by any measure, monstrous. Frustrated that the existing additives were being too easily removed, federal officials ordered the formulas changed, ordered industry to make the denatured alcohol more poisonous, harder to renature, deadlier. They added wood alcohol, methanol in increasing concentrations. They added other lethal compounds. The logic, as the dry enforcers explained it, was a kind of grim deterrence. If the bootleg liquor was poison, people would stop drinking it. They did not stop drinking it. They could not tell which barrels had been adequately cleaned and which had not. The chemists working for the bootleggers could not always strip the poison out completely, and so people simply died. They died by the thousands. In the holiday season alone, in cities across the country, the hospitals would fill in the days after Christmas and New Year's with the blinded and the dying, people who had done nothing more than buy a bottle to celebrate with. The medical examiner of New York City, a fierce and principled man named Charles Norris, became one of the program's most outraged public critics, documenting death after death and accusing the government, in effect, of mass poisoning of its own citizens. He was not wrong. By the time it was all over, the federal poisoning program is estimated to have killed something on the order of 10,000 people, ordinary drinkers, killed not by gangsters, but by their own government's deliberate decision to make the forbidden liquor lethal. It is one of the strangest and most disturbing chapters in the whole strange story, and it tells you something essential about the world the bootlegger lived in. This was not a clean conflict between honest law and dishonest crime. It was a vast moral fog in which the government poisoned its citizens, and the citizens broke the law to drink, and the criminals filled the gap the law had opened, and almost nobody involved felt that they were the ones in the wrong. The bootlegger, who renatured industrial alcohol, could genuinely tell himself he was doing a service, taking a poisoned product and making it safer, protecting his customers from the very poison the government had added. Sometimes he even believed it. Sometimes it was even true. Now let us leave the dark hills behind and go down to the sea, because some of the most romantic and most genuinely thrilling figures of the entire era were not in the mountains at all. They were out on the cold gray Atlantic in the dead of night, running ships full of fine liquor through the dark water toward a coastline crawling with the law. The geography of the thing was elegant in its simplicity. The United States could ban the making and selling of liquor within its borders, but it could not ban liquor from existing in the rest of the world. Just across the water, the trade flourished perfectly legally. The Bahamas, a short hop from the Florida coast, became a vast liquor warehouse. Its little capital of Nassau transformed almost overnight from a sleepy backwater into a boomtown groaning with crates of scotch and rum and champagne, all of it waiting to be carried north. Cuba was another. So were the British and French islands of the Caribbean, and to the north, Canada, where Prohibition was patchy, brief, and quickly abandoned, became an enormous spigot of legal liquor pointed straight at the thirsty United States, its distilleries running at full capacity, openly selling to buyers who everyone knew perfectly well were going to smuggle every drop of it across the border. The classic method off the eastern seaboard was the institution that came to be called Rum Row. A captain would load his ship in Nassau or some other foreign port, sail north, and then anchor in international waters just outside the limit of American jurisdiction, at first only 3 miles offshore, later pushed out to 12. There, sitting legally in international waters with his hold full of legal liquor, he was untouchable. He could anchor for weeks. And off the great cities of the coast, off New York, off Boston, off the New Jersey shore, these supply ships gathered in such numbers that they formed a kind of floating liquor market, a row of ships strung along the horizon, sometimes a dozen, sometimes far more, lit up at night and doing a brisk and almost festive trade. The actual smuggling, the dangerous part, was done by small, fast boats called contact boats, which would slip out from the shore under cover of darkness, run out to the anchored supply ships, buy their cargo, and race back in toward some hidden cove or quiet stretch of beach where the liquor could be landed and loaded onto waiting trucks. This was the moment of maximum peril, the run from the row to the shore, because this was where the Coast Guard was waiting. And so it became a contest of speed and nerve and engineering. The contact boats grew faster and faster, fitted with surplus aircraft engines that could push them along at terrifying speeds, while the Coast Guard scrambled to keep up, and the dark water off the coast filled with silent running shapes, throttles wide open, no lights showing, men crouched low and praying not to hear the bark of a cutter's gun out of the blackness. The Atlantic was only one front. Far to the north and west, along the great freshwater border between the United States and Canada, the smuggling took on an entirely different character, less the open sea adventure of Rum Row and more an industrial scale river of liquor flowing across a line on a map. Nowhere was this truer than along the narrow stretch of water where Detroit faced the Canadian city of Windsor across barely half a mile of river. On the far bank sat a fully legal Canadian liquor industry, distilling and selling as fast as it could. On the near bank sat one of the thirstiest industrial cities in America, packed with auto workers, earning good wages with nothing legal to spend them on after the whistle blew. Between the two ran a strip of water so short and so busy that it became, by common reckoning, the single greatest smuggling artery in the entire country, the place where an astonishing share of all the illegal liquor in America made its crossing. They called it the Detroit Windsor Funnel, and the trade through it was almost beyond policing. In the warm months, 1,000 small boats might dart back and forth across the river in a single night, and in the winter, when the river froze solid, the smugglers simply drove across the ice. Cars, trucks, even sledges loaded with cases, racing the thaw, sometimes breaking through into the black water and vanishing with their cargo and their drivers both. Some operators ran cables and pipes along the river bottom, pumping liquor across underwater like a utility. The whole border city of Detroit floated, in a sense, on a sea of smuggled whiskey, and the liquor traffic became one of the largest industries in the region, rivaling the automobiles themselves. It was bootlegging not as buccaneer adventure, but as something closer to ordinary commerce. High volume, relentless, woven so deeply into the life of the city that stopping it was never a serious possibility. The most celebrated of all the rum-runners was a man named Bill McCoy, and his legend deserves a moment because it captures something true about the strange honor that could exist even in this dishonorable trade. McCoy was a boat builder from Florida, a teetotaler who barely drank himself, who came to the trade for the money and stayed for the adventure. What set him apart was that he refused to cheat. In a business riddled with watered down liquor and faked labels and outright poison, McCoy sold the real thing: genuine, undiluted, top quality imported liquor, exactly what it claimed to be. He never carried a weapon, never paid a bribe, and ran his operation with a kind of buccaneer's integrity that made him famous up and down the coast. There is a popular story, impossible to prove, fiercely disputed by etymologists, but too good to leave out, that the phrase "the real McCoy," meaning the genuine article, comes from him and his honest liquor. True or not, the fact that people believed it tells you how he was regarded. He was a smuggler, a criminal, a breaker of the law of the land, and he was also, by the lights of his trade, a man of his word. Life on Rum Row was not all moonlight and adventure, though. It was long, cold, dull, and dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with the law. Crews could spend weeks anchored offshore, bored out of their minds, rolling in the swell, running low on food and fresh water, waiting for contact boats that might or might not come. The sea did not care about prohibition. Storms sank ships and drowned men with perfect indifference. And the trade attracted inevitably the worst kind of predators, the go-through men, pirates who would pose as buyers, pull alongside a supply ship, and then rob it at gunpoint, taking the liquor and the cash and sometimes the lives of the crew, killing them and scuttling the ship and leaving no witnesses and no trace. Out there, beyond the reach of any law, in waters that belonged to no nation, A man's only protection was his wits, his guns, and the reputation he had built. It was the closest thing the 20th century had to the age of piracy, and the men who lived it knew exactly what they were: smugglers, adventurers, outlaws of the open sea. The liquor that came off Rum Row, or down out of the hills, or across the river from Canada, was useless sitting on a beach or in a barn. It had to be moved, moved fast, moved quietly, moved past the police and the agents and the hijackers to the warehouses and the speakeasies where it would be sold. And so was born one of the most consequential figures of the whole era, a figure whose legacy is still roaring around oval tracks every weekend to this day: the bootleg driver, the wheelman, the man who ran the liquor over the night roads in a car built for one purpose, which was to go faster than anything that might be chasing it. The car was everything. The classic liquor runner's vehicle came to be called the Whiskey Six, typically a powerful six-cylinder automobile, a Buick or a Studebaker or a Hudson, chosen for its engine and then transformed in a backyard or a barn into something its manufacturer would never have recognized. The men who built these cars were artists of a peculiar and illegal kind. They tore out the back seats and reinforced the rear suspension with heavy-duty springs so that 1,000 pounds of liquor in the trunk and the floorboards would not sag the tail of the car down to the road and give the whole game away. They tuned and bored and modified the engines for raw, brutal speed. They installed switches that could cut the taillights at the flick of a finger, so a driver being chased at night could vanish into the dark in an instant. Some rigged tanks of oil or smoke that could be released onto the road behind them, fouling the windshield of a pursuing car. Some mounted spotlights to blind the police, or devices to scatter the road behind them. The car was a weapon, and the men who built and drove them poured into that work an ingenuity that in another life might have made them great engineers, and in some cases eventually did. And the driving itself was an art form practiced at the absolute edge of human skill. Picture it. You are on a narrow country road in the mountains at 2 o'clock in the morning. No moon, your headlights off because lights can be seen for miles, running by memory and feel and the faint shape of the road against the sky. Your car is heavy with liquor, nose light and tail heavy, handling like a different animal than the one you learned to drive. You know every curve of this road, every dip and rise and washout, because your life depends on knowing it. And somewhere behind you, maybe, are headlights, the law, or worse, hijackers. And the only thing between you and prison or a bullet is your foot on the throttle and your hands on the wheel and your absolute refusal to lift off the gas when every instinct in your body is screaming at you to slow down. The drivers developed maneuvers that became legend: the bootleg turn, a way of throwing the car into a sudden, sliding 180-degree reversal of direction at speed, so that a driver could find a roadblock ahead of him, spin the car on a dime, and be roaring back the way he came before the police had even fully understood what they were looking at. These men became, without anyone planning it, the finest race drivers in America. And when Prohibition finally ended, all that talent and all those fast cars and all that fierce competitive spirit did not simply evaporate. The young men who had run liquor through the Appalachian nights began on their Sunday afternoons to race each other, to settle on dirt tracks and cow pastures, The endless arguments about whose car was fastest and whose driving was best. People came to watch, people began to bet, promoters began to organize, and out of those dusty Sunday races, run by reformed and not so reformed liquor haulers in cars first built to outrun the law, grew the entire sport of American stock car racing. The greatest of the early stars had learned their craft hauling moonshine, and they never entirely hid it. The roar you hear at the racetrack today is, in a very real and direct sense, the echo of the Whiskey Six running dark down a mountain road, 90 years gone. But we have been out in the cold long enough, out on the dark sea, up in the freezing hills, on the black night roads. Let us go now to where all of this was heading. Let us go inside, into the warmth and the light and the music, into the place where the liquor was finally drunk. Let us go into the speakeasy. The name itself tells you something. To speak easy was to speak softly, quietly, so as not to be overheard, and you spoke easy at the door, gave the password low and fast through the little sliding panel in the heavy door, the peephole sliding back, the eye appraising you, the door opening just wide enough to admit you, and then closing again behind, sealing you into another world. Because that is exactly what it was, another world, a secret world, hidden behind the false front of a laundry or a barber shop or a flower store, or simply an unmarked door down a flight of basement steps, invisible from the street, known only to those who knew. The whole pleasure of it was partly the secrecy itself, the delicious sense of having been admitted to something hidden, the feeling that the dull, respectable world up there on the sidewalk had no idea what was happening down here in the glow. There were, by some estimates, more than 30,000 of these establishments in New York City alone, perhaps as many as 100,000, depending on whose count you believe, which was remarkably far more than the number of legal saloons the city had possessed before Prohibition. The law meant to kill drinking had, by driving it underground and making it glamorous, multiplied the number of places to drink. They ranged across every imaginable level of luxury and squalor. At the bottom were the dives, the cheap blind pigs and gin joints, dark rooms with a plank across two barrels for a bar, serving raw bathtub liquor to men who drank to get drunk and nothing else. At the top were the great glittering clubs, the legendary establishments where the cream of society and the cream of the underworld mingled under the same chandeliers, places of white tablecloths and live orchestras and dance floors, and astonishing prices, where a senator might be drinking at one table and a gangster at the next, and where the bribes paid to keep the police away were simply built into the cost of the champagne. And here is the thing that the temperance crusaders never saw coming, the great social transformation that Prohibition accidentally produced. The speakeasy changed who drank, and how, and with whom. The old saloon had been a man's world, a rough male sanctuary that respectable women did not enter and would not have wanted to. But the speakeasy was something new. It was a place of glamour and music and dancing, a place to be seen, and women came in numbers, came on their own and with dates, and in laughing groups, sat at the bar that had once been forbidden to them, ordered cocktails, smoked cigarettes, and drank shoulder to shoulder with the men. The cocktail itself, that whole elaborate art of mixing liquor with juices and bitters and sweeteners, flourished in this new soil precisely because so much of the available liquor was so bad. You mixed it with other things, partly to make it taste like something other than the harsh, raw spirit it actually was. The flapper, the bobbed haired, short skirted, cocktail drinking modern young woman who became the very symbol of the decade, was in a real sense a creature of the speakeasy. The dry crusade had been led in its earliest days largely by women seeking to protect the home from the saloon, and one of its lasting effects was to bring women out of the home and into the bar as equals forever. The variety of these hidden places was almost endless, and so was the ingenuity that went into concealing them. Some hid behind the false fronts of legitimate businesses so that you entered through a working soda fountain or a real flower shop and slipped through a hidden door in the back. Some announced themselves only by a particular knock, or a card you had to show, or a name you had to know and whisper. The grandest of them developed elaborate defenses against the raids everyone knew were coming. A famous New York club kept its liquor behind a cleverly engineered bar that could, at the press of a hidden button, dump every incriminating bottle down a chute and into the sewer in seconds, leaving the agents who burst in to find nothing but an innocent room full of startled diners and not a drop of alcohol in sight. There were establishments that catered to the artists and the writers and the bohemians, smoky cellars where the great talents of the age argued and drank till dawn. There were others where cafe society and the Broadway crowd and the visiting millionaires gathered to be seen, where a table was as much a social statement as a place to drink. And there were the countless thousands of humble ones, the ordinary neighborhood joints in basements and back rooms where working people gathered after their shifts exactly as they always had, simply more quietly now, behind a locked door with a lookout watching the street. The whole social geography of American drinking had not been abolished. It had merely been driven indoors and underground, multiplied, and dusted over with a glamorous coat of secrecy. The music mattered too, more than almost anything. This was the age of jazz, that brilliant, restless, improvised American music pouring up out of the black communities of New Orleans and Memphis and Chicago and Harlem, and the speakeasy was its great incubator. In the clubs of Harlem especially, the music reached heights that have never been surpassed, though we must not look away from the ugliness threaded through even that glory. The famous clubs where black musicians of staggering genius performed for audiences of wealthy white patrons, in rooms where black customers themselves were often not welcome. The liquor, the music, the dancing, the mingling of classes, and the loosening of old rules, the sheer electric sense of being alive in a forbidden room in a forbidden time. It all fused into something that we still, a century later, reach for when we try to imagine the glamour of the age. We have romanticized it, certainly, but there was something genuinely there to romanticize. For a few hours, behind a locked door and a whispered password, in the warm light and the curl of cigarette smoke and the wail of a clarinet, people felt free. Let us slow down now and simply be there for a while. Let us spend an evening inside one of these places and feel what it was like from the moment you stepped off the dark street to the small hours when you finally stumbled back out into the dawn. You come down a quiet side street where nothing seems to be happening. There is a plain door, perhaps below the level of the sidewalk, down a few worn steps. There is no sign, or there is a sign for some business that plainly is not operating at this hour. A tailor, a coal merchant, a club for some fictional fraternal order. You knock in a particular way if you know it, and a small panel slides back at eye level, and a pair of eyes looks out at you, weighing you, deciding. You give the word. The panel slides shut. There is a pause in which your heart does a small foolish flutter, even though you have done this 100 times. Then the bolts draw back, and the door opens, and the warmth and the noise and the light come spilling out around you, and a hand draws you inside, and the door shuts behind you, and the cold street and the cold law are sealed away on the other side of it. Inside, the air is thick, thick with smoke, thick with perfume and sweat, and the sweet, sharp smell of spilled liquor, thick with the heat of bodies, and the noise of 100 conversations, and a band playing somewhere across the room. The light is low and golden. There is a long bar, perhaps, with a brass rail, and behind it a man in shirt sleeves and an apron working with the swift economy of someone who has made 10,000 drinks and could make 10,000 more in his sleep. The shelves behind him hold bottles with elegant labels, though the labels mean little. The gin in the fine imported bottle may well have been mixed in a bathtub across town this very afternoon. Juniper and glycerin stirred into raw industrial spirit and bottled with a counterfeit label, and you know this, and you drink it anyway, because everyone does. You find a table, a waiter comes, and you order, and your drink arrives in a heavy glass, and the first sip is harsh and hot, and not, if you are honest, very good. But the cocktail it has been mixed into masks the worst of it, the citrus and the sugar and the bitters doing their kind work, and the second sip is better, and by the third you have stopped noticing. The warmth spreads, the room softens. Across the floor, couples are dancing close to the music, and the music is wonderful, the band leaning into it, the trumpet climbing up over the noise of the crowd and pulling something loose in your chest. At the next table, a man in an expensive suit is laughing too loudly with two women in beaded dresses. You cannot tell if he is a banker or a gangster, and it does not matter, and that is rather the point. Down the bar, a famous face you half recognize from the newspapers is drinking quietly with his hat pushed back. The owner moves through the room like a host at a party, shaking hands, sharing jokes, his eyes never quite still, always counting, always watching the door. Because the door is always the thing. Everyone in the room knows, in some back corner of their mind, that on any given night the panel might slide back and the eyes might see the wrong faces, and the word might come down the bar in an urgent whisper, a raid, a raid, and the band might lurch into a different tune that is secretly a signal, and the bartender might pull a hidden lever that tips the entire stock of bottles down a chute and into a vat of water below, destroying the evidence in a single crash, and the patrons might melt toward the hidden second exit that every good speakeasy kept ready. Most nights, none of this happens. The bribes have been paid, the police have been squared, the agents are drinking somewhere else. But everyone knows it could, and that knowledge, far from ruining the evening, is part of its strange flavor, the faint, constant spice of danger, the sense that this warmth and this music and this freedom are stolen, temporary, lit against the dark like a candle that might be snuffed at any moment. Perhaps that is why people drank as they did in those years, with such determination and such joy. They were drinking in the teeth of the law, in defiance of it, and there is a particular sweetness to a pleasure that someone has tried and failed to forbid you. And so the night wears on, and the music plays, and the glasses empty and fill, and somewhere in the small dark hours, you finally rise, unsteady, and make your way back up the worn steps and out the plain door into a street gone gray with the first light, and the cold air hits you, and the ordinary respectable world is beginning to stir. The milk wagons, the early workers, the whole sober daylight machinery of the dry republic, and you walk home through it carrying your small secret, one of millions of small secrets, all of them adding up to the great open lie at the heart of the age. It would be easy telling this story to make it a story only of men, the rum runner and the wheelman and the gangster, all of them hard faced fellows in hats. But that would be to miss some of the most remarkable figures of the entire era, because the world of the bootlegger was, in its strange way, more open to women than almost any legitimate business of the time. The black market did not care about your gender any more than it cared about your accent or your religion. It cared whether you could deliver, and some women delivered magnificently. Consider Gertrude Lithgow, who became known up and down the coast and across the Caribbean as the Bahama Queen. An American woman of striking presence and formidable nerve, she ran a wholesale liquor operation out of Nassau in the thick of the boom, dealing in genuine Scotch whiskey, dealing with the hard men of the rum-running trade as an absolute equal, and tolerating not the slightest disrespect. The stories told of her readiness to back her words with a pistol, of her refusal to be cheated or cowed, made her a legend in her own time. She moved through a world of smugglers and pirates and predators as one of them, and she prospered, and she walked away from it, which is more than many of the men could say. Consider Willie Carter Sharp in the rough liquor country of Franklin County, Virginia, a place so saturated with moonshine that it was called, only half in jest, the wettest county in the world, the moonshine capital of America, where an astonishing fraction of the entire population was tangled up in the trade in one way or another. Sharp became famous as a driver, one of the very best, running convoys of liquor down out of the mountains at speeds that left the law standing. They said the diamonds set in her teeth flashed as she roared through the towns, the crowds gathering to watch her come through, half outlaw and half folk hero. When the great federal conspiracy trial finally came for Franklin County and dragged its secrets into the daylight, her name was among the famous ones, a woman who had made her reputation behind the wheel in a trade where the wheel meant everything. And consider the great hostesses, the queens of the speakeasy floor, of whom the most famous was a former silent film actress named Texas Gwinan. She did not smuggle the liquor or brew it, she presided over it. She ran a series of celebrated New York nightclubs, and she was the show, a brassy, quick-witted, utterly fearless mistress of ceremonies who greeted her wealthy customers each night with the cheerful mocking cry of, "Hello, sucker." She fleeced the rich and the famous with a smile, and they loved her for it, lined up to be insulted and overcharged, because she made them feel they were at the center of the world. When the police raided her clubs, which they did again and again, she turned even the arrests into theater, once reportedly wearing a necklace strung with little padlocks as a defiant joke about how often she'd been hauled in. She made and lost fortunes, defied the law to its face, and became one of the genuine celebrities of the age, a woman who had built an empire on charm and nerve in a business that was supposed to belong entirely to men. These were not gentle women, and we should not sentimentalize them. They operated in a brutal, dangerous, often violent world, and they survived in it by being as tough and as ruthless as it required. But there is something undeniably striking about the fact that the great forbidden economy of Prohibition offered ambitious, capable women a kind of scope and authority that the respectable world of the 1920s flatly denied them. A woman could not easily become a bank president or a factory owner in those years, but she could become the Bahama Queen, or the fastest driver in Franklin County, or the most famous nightclub hostess in New York. The black market was an equal opportunity employer in its grim and lawless way, and a certain kind of extraordinary woman found in it the room to become extraordinary. Not all the liquor in America flowed through speakeasies and smugglers' coves. A surprising amount of it flowed, perfectly legally, right out the front door of the corner pharmacy, because the Volstead Act, for all its sweeping prohibition, carved out a loophole that turned out to be one of the largest and most exploited in the whole law. Liquor, the Act allowed, could still be prescribed by a physician for medicinal purposes. And it turned out that an enormous number of Americans developed almost overnight a great many ailments that could be cured by nothing so well as a pint of good whiskey. The system was beautifully simple to abuse. A licensed doctor could write a prescription for medicinal liquor, and the patient could take that prescription to a licensed pharmacy and have it filled, a pint of whiskey every 10 days or so, for whatever complaint the doctor was willing to put his name to. The whiskey came in official bottles with government labels drawn from the great stores of pre-prohibition liquor that the law allowed to be kept and sold for this purpose. And the conditions for which it was prescribed were, shall we say, generous. Whiskey was prescribed for the flu, for indigestion, for anemia, for high blood pressure and low blood pressure, for cancer and depression and old age, and the simple condition of being a person who wanted a drink and could find a doctor willing to be paid for the favor. Some doctors made a tidy second income writing prescriptions for patients they barely examined. Some pharmacies did a roaring trade that had very little to do with medicine. The great winner in all of this was the American drugstore. The corner pharmacy, with its legal access to medicinal liquor, became one of the few places in the country where a person could obtain genuine, government-guaranteed, properly made whiskey, and the pharmacy business boomed accordingly. One famous drugstore chain, in particular, expanded with extraordinary speed across exactly the years of Prohibition, growing from a small handful of stores to a vast national network, a growth that its founder always attributed to the milkshake and the soda fountain, and that a great many cynical observers attributed to something rather stronger kept behind the counter. Whatever the truth of any single case, the broad pattern was undeniable. Prohibition was very good business indeed for the legal sellers of medicinal alcohol, and the line between a pharmacist and a bootlegger could become, in practice, awfully thin. It is one of the quieter ironies of the era, and one of the most revealing. The law had not actually stopped the country from drinking. It had simply sorted the drinkers by their wealth and their connections. The poor drank dangerous moonshine and poisoned industrial alcohol in dark dives and took their chances. The middle classes drank bathtub gin in speakeasies and trusted to luck, and the comfortable and the well connected could, if they chose, drink genuine bonded whiskey legally with a doctor's blessing and a government label on the bottle, having simply paid the modest toll of a sympathetic physician's fee. Prohibition was supposed to make America equal in its sobriety. Instead, it became, like so much else, a matter of what you could afford. The medicinal loophole was the largest, but it was not the only one, and the ingenuity with which Americans found and widened these gaps in the law is, in its way, a kind of monument to the national character. Where there is a wall, there is someone studying it for the gap, and the Volstead Act, for all its severity, had gaps. There was the sacramental exemption. The law, mindful of religious liberty, permitted wine to be made and distributed for sacramental purposes, for the rituals of the church and the synagogue, where wine was not a luxury but a holy necessity. And so, predictably, the production of sacramental wine surged to levels that no honest accounting of the nation's actual religious devotion could possibly explain. Congregations swelled miraculously on paper. Wine flowed to clergy real and entirely invented. The grape industry of California, which might have been ruined by Prohibition, found clever ways to survive and even thrive within and around these exemptions, and the demand for sacramental wine reached heights that would have implied a sudden and overwhelming national religious awakening had anyone been naive enough to believe it. There was the loophole hiding inside the grape itself. The law permitted the head of a household to make a modest quantity of fruit juice or cider at home for personal use, and the courts and regulators interpreted this in ways that effectively allowed home winemaking on a considerable scale. The California grape growers, quick to seize the opportunity, began shipping their product east in a remarkable new form. Blocks of dried, concentrated grapes, pressed and packaged for the home market. And these products, the story goes, came with instructions, warnings, really, phrased as warnings, that told the purchaser in careful detail exactly what they must not do, lest the harmless grape concentrate accidentally turn into wine. Do not dissolve this in water and add yeast. Do not store it in a cool, dark place for 3 weeks. Do not, under any circumstances, allow it to ferment, for then it would become wine, and that would be illegal. Every customer understood these warnings perfectly. They were, of course, a recipe, written backwards, and the grape concentrate sold extraordinarily well. There was beer for the home, and cider, and the simple, endless creativity of people who wanted a drink and had a law to get around. The point of all these loopholes, taken together, is not really about the specific mechanisms. It is about what they reveal. A law is only as strong as the consent of the people it governs, and the American people had not consented to this one. They had voted for it in a fit of wartime idealism, perhaps, or let it be voted for them by an organized and determined minority. But in their daily lives, in their homes and their churches and their corner drugstores, they declined to obey it, and they were endlessly inventive in their disobedience, and the law became more and more a kind of national joke, a thing that everyone formally respected and almost no one actually followed. For most of the people in this story, bootlegging was a way to make a living, a dangerous, illegal, but essentially modest way to put food on the table or get a foothold in a hard country. But for a few, it became something else entirely, a road to wealth and power on a scale that would have been unimaginable in any honest trade. These were the kings of the bootleggers, the men who saw that the great forbidden thirst of a nation was a river of money and who built empires to channel it. Consider George Remus, who called himself, with some justice, the king of the bootleggers. Remus was a Cincinnati lawyer, a brilliant and methodical man, and he did something that none of the street corner operators had the education or the patience to do. He read the law itself, read it carefully, and found the empire hidden inside it. He understood the medicinal loophole better than anyone, and he understood that it created a perfectly legal supply of whiskey, the bonded liquor held in government licensed warehouses for medicinal sale. So Remus began, quite legally, to buy the distilleries and the wholesale drug companies that controlled that liquor. He bought them up, one after another, until he controlled a vast share of the legal medicinal whiskey in the entire country. And then, having acquired the liquor through the front door of the law, he simply diverted it out the back, his own trucks, hijacking his own legally purchased liquor on its way to legitimate buyers, spilling it into the black market where it was worth many times more. It was a scheme of breathtaking elegance, a way of turning the law's own loophole into a machine for printing money, and it made him, for a few dizzying years, one of the richest men in America. He threw legendary parties at his Cincinnati mansion with a swimming pool and an orchestra and famous guests, and he gave each of the women a new automobile as a party favor. His story ended in scandal and tragedy and a sensational murder trial, as so many of these stories did. But for a brief and brilliant moment, a man had read the fine print of Prohibition more cleverly than anyone alive, and become a king on the strength of it. Consider Roy Olmsted, far away on the other side of the country, who became known as the king of the Puget Sound bootleggers. Olmsted had been a police officer in Seattle, a lieutenant, in fact, one of the youngest on the force, a rising star, until he grasped that there was vastly more money to be made supplying the liquor than enforcing the ban on it. He left the law, or was pushed out of it, and built one of the most efficient and professional smuggling operations on the entire West Coast, running good Canadian liquor down from British Columbia on a fleet of fast boats with the discipline of a well-run shipping company. And here is the most telling thing about Olmsted, the thing that set him apart from the brutal gangsters who would come to dominate the public imagination. He forbade his men to carry guns. He ran his empire on the principle that it was better to lose a load of liquor than to take a life, that a smuggler who killed was a smuggler who brought down the full weight of the law, and that good liquor, honestly delivered, was a better long-term business than terror. He saw himself, and many of his customers saw him, not as a criminal, but as a businessman providing a service that the people clearly wanted and the law foolishly forbade. His operation was eventually brought down by the new technology of the wiretap, and his case went all the way to the Supreme Court, where it became a landmark in the long argument over privacy and government surveillance that we are still having today. But in his prime, Olmsted embodied a possibility that the era kept dangling and kept snatching away, the possibility of bootlegging as an almost gentlemanly business, violent only when it had to be, professional, even principled. It was a possibility that the rise of organized crime would crush utterly, because there was another road that the great forbidden river of money could take, and it led not to the gentleman bootlegger, but to the organized criminal syndicate, the machine, the mob. And no single figure embodies that road in the public mind then and now, like the man whose name became synonymous with the entire era, Alphonse Capone. To understand Capone is to understand a kind of grim economic logic. The trade in illegal liquor was generating sums of money so vast that they distorted everything they touched. And in a black market, there is no court to settle your disputes, no police to protect your property, no contract that anyone will enforce. If a rival moves into your territory, if a supplier cheats you, if a customer refuses to pay, you cannot sue, you can only fight. And so the immense profits of bootlegging flowed naturally and inevitably toward the people most willing and most able to apply organized violence, to control territory, to enforce agreements, to eliminate competitors, to terrify everyone into staying in line. The gangster did not arise in spite of prohibition. The gangster arose because of prohibition, was created by it, was the precise and predictable product of pouring billions of dollars through a market where the only available enforcement mechanism was the gun. Capone built, in Chicago, an organization of staggering reach and profitability. At its height, it was taking in something like $60 million a year, an almost incomprehensible sum for the time, from liquor, from gambling, from prostitution, from extortion, from the thousand rackets that organized crime spun off from its core business of supplying the city with beer and whiskey. And the genius of the operation, if we can call it that, was not really in the liquor itself, but in the systematic corruption that protected it. Capone did not so much defy the government of Chicago as purchase it. Police, judges, aldermen, the mayor's office itself, the organization paid them all, wove them into a web of bribery and complicity so total that for years it operated less like an outlaw enterprise than like a shadow government, providing the city with the beer it wanted and skimming a fortune off the top, while the official legal government looked the other way and pocketed its share. Capone understood too the power of image, and he cultivated his own legend with a showman's instinct. He gave interviews. He dressed in beautiful suits and sat at ringside at the boxing matches and was cheered by the crowds. When the Depression hit and people were starving, he opened a soup kitchen in Chicago that fed thousands of the hungry, and the newspapers ran the photographs, and to a great many ordinary people, he became a strange kind of hero, a man who gave them the beer the government had taken away, and the soup the government failed to provide, a Robin Hood in a fedora. He liked to point out, with a certain logic that was hard entirely to refute, that he was only selling people what they obviously wanted, that he was a businessman whose business the government had foolishly made illegal, that if the public did not want what he sold, he would have no customers. "I give the public what the public wants," he said more or less, again and again. "All I do is supply a demand." But beneath the suits and the soup kitchen and the businessman's patter, the foundation of it all was murder. The territories were held by terror. The agreements were enforced by the gun. The rivals were not outbid but eliminated. And the violence, as the decade wore on and the stakes grew higher and the gangs fought for control of the river of money, grew steadily worse, worse and more public and more shocking, until it produced the single event that finally turned the stomach of the nation it had been entertaining. For most of the decade, America had watched the gang wars with a kind of horrified fascination, almost as entertainment. The newspaper headlines, the dramatic killings, the colorful nicknames, the whole bloody opera of it kept at a comfortable distance, like a movie. The gangsters mostly killed each other, after all, and a public that did not much like the law they were breaking found it hard to mourn very deeply for the men who broke it most violently. But on a cold February morning in 1929, in a garage on the north side of Chicago, something happened that was harder to wave away. Members of Capone's organization, some of them reportedly dressed as police officers to lull their victims into compliance, lined 7 men of a rival gang up against a brick wall and cut them down with machine gun fire, a long, deliberate, mechanical slaughter that left the bodies heaped on the garage floor in pools of blood and left the brick wall behind them stitched with bullet holes. It came to be called the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and the photographs of it ran in every newspaper in the country, and something shifted. It was the sheer cold theatricality of it, perhaps, the fake police uniforms, the firing squad arrangement, the military efficiency of the killing. It looked less like a crime than like an execution, less like the underworld settling its scores than like a war being waged in the streets of an American city. And it forced the comfortable public to confront a question it had been avoiding for nearly a decade. What, exactly, had they unleashed? They had passed a law to make the country more wholesome, more sober, more safe, and the law had given them this: armies of gunmen, machine guns in the streets, fortunes built on murder, whole city governments bought and paid for, and now this butcher's heap in a garage on a winter morning. The arithmetic had gone horribly wrong somewhere, and the massacre made it impossible to keep pretending otherwise. The killing did not end with the massacre, of course. If anything, it intensified, and Capone himself, who had reached for the headlines so eagerly, now found that the heat he had drawn was burning him. The federal government, unable to convict him of the murders and bootlegging that everyone knew he was guilty of, finally took him down by a route that seems almost comically mundane against the backdrop of all that blood. They convicted him of tax evasion. The King of Chicago, the man who had ordered killings and bought a city, was brought to ruin because he had not paid his income taxes on the fortune he had made breaking the law. He went to prison, and his health, already failing from disease, was collapsed, and the man who had ruled an empire ended his days a broken figure, his mind gone, dying quietly far from the city he had terrorized and dazzled. But the violence he embodied had done its work on the public conscience. The romance of the gangster was curdling. The party slowly was beginning to feel like something people wanted to leave. We have spent a great deal of time on the people who broke the law. Let us spend a little time now on the people who were supposed to enforce it, because their story is, in its own way, just as revealing and a good deal more poignant, since they were fighting a war that, in retrospect, could not possibly have been won. The federal force charged with enforcing prohibition was from the beginning almost absurdly inadequate to the task. To dry up an entire continent, to police thousands of miles of coastline and border, to find the countless stills hidden in the countryside, to shut down the tens of thousands of speakeasies in a single city, to stop a commerce that a majority of the population actively wanted to continue, the government deployed a force that numbered at any given time only a few thousand agents for the entire nation. It was as if you had been ordered to bail out the ocean with a teaspoon. The mathematics of it were hopeless from the first day, and they never improved. And the agents themselves were a deeply mixed lot. The job paid poorly, and it placed a man every single day in temptation's path. He spent his days surrounded by criminals who were swimming in cash, men who would gladly pay him many times his meager salary simply to look the other way for an evening. A great many agents took the money. Corruption ran through the enforcement apparatus from top to bottom. Agents on the take, supervisors on the take. The whole machinery of enforcement riddled with men who had quietly switched sides, who tipped off the speakeasies before the raids and collected their envelopes and went home to families they fed on the proceeds of the very trade they were sworn to stamp out. It was perhaps inevitable. You cannot ask a poorly paid man to stand guard over a river of gold and be shocked when some of it sticks to his hands. But not all of them, and here the story turns briefly to comedy, because the two most famous and most successful prohibition agents in the entire country were a pair of unlikely heroes who fought the war with wit instead of force. Izzy Einstein and Moe Smith were two middle-aged, heavy-set, utterly unremarkable-looking men. Izzy, a former postal clerk, round and jovial and gifted with languages, and they became the terror of the speakeasies through the simple, brilliant strategy of disguise and deception. They did not kick down doors. They talked their way through them. Izzy was a genius of impersonation. He posed as everything imaginable: a businessman, a musician, a streetcar conductor, an iceman even, on one celebrated occasion, simply walking up to a bar and announcing cheerfully that he was a prohibition agent, which the bartender found so hilarious that he served him a drink on the house and was promptly arrested. The two of them made thousands upon thousands of arrests, a number no other agents came close to, and they did it with a showman's flair that made them celebrities. Their exploits splashed across the newspapers, the public delighting in their cleverness. There is something wonderful and something sad in it both at once. These two cheerful, brilliant men, treating the great hopeless war as the absurd comedy it largely was, racking up arrests that did nothing whatsoever to slow the tide, beloved by a public that adored them precisely because everyone understood, deep down, that the whole enterprise was a farce. For that is the truth that hung over all of it. The agents who took bribes and the agents who fought honestly were, in the end, equally futile, because the thing they were fighting was not really crime at all. It was desire, the ordinary desire of ordinary people for a drink at the end of a hard day. And you cannot arrest desire, you cannot raid it nor or seize it or shut it down. As long as the want was there, and the want was everywhere, the supply would find its way to it, around or over or through whatever the law could put in its path. The agents bailed the ocean with their teaspoons, year after year, and the ocean did not so much as notice them. The corruption did not stay neatly contained within the ranks of the Prohibition agents. It could not. The sums of money involved were simply too enormous, and money on that scale does not respect boundaries. It seeped outward, upward, into every joint and seam of American public life, until the law meant to purify the nation had instead become one of the greatest engines of corruption the country had ever known. The police took it, of course, beat cops who collected their weekly envelopes from the speakeasies on their beat, precinct captains who organized the collection into a smooth and reliable system, whole departments that operated in effect as a protection racket, selling immunity to the very businesses they were supposed to shut down. The prosecutors took it, declining to bring cases, or bringing them weakly, or losing them on purpose. The judges took it, dismissing charges and handing down trivial fines that the bootleggers paid out of petty cash and regarded simply as a cost of doing business, a license fee. The politicians took it, from the local alderman all the way up toward the heights of state and then even national government, the bribes flowing into campaign coffers and private pockets alike, until in some cities and some states it became genuinely difficult to say where the criminal organization ended and the elected government began. And this, in the long run, may have been the deepest damage that Prohibition did, deeper than the poisonings, deeper even than the gang violence. It taught a whole generation of Americans a corrosive lesson that the law was a joke, that everyone broke it, that the police and the judges and the politicians were all on the take, that respectability was a mask, and honesty was for suckers, and the whole grand machinery of American government could be bought for the right price. It bred a contempt for law and authority that did not vanish when Prohibition ended, a cynicism that lingered. When ordinary, decent people, people who considered themselves law abiding citizens, break a particular law every single day, casually, without guilt, in full view of police they have bribed to ignore them, something happens to their relationship with law itself. The whole idea of the law as something sacred, something binding, something that decent people simply obey, took a wound during those 13 years from which it arguably never fully recovered. The temperance crusaders had dreamed of a nation made cleaner and more honest by the banishing of drink. What they got instead was a nation marinated in corruption, where the police worked for the gangsters and the judges took bribes, and the most ordinary citizen winked at the law every Friday night, where the gap between what people said and what people did had grown into a chasm, and where the very idea of public virtue had been quietly, thoroughly, almost cheerfully hollowed out. It was perhaps the most complete reversal of intention in the whole history of American reform. They set out to make the country good. They made it, in too many ways, a school for cynicism. We have talked of fortunes and empires, of fast boats and secret clubs, of the romance and the danger and the strange dark comedy of it all. But underneath the glamour, there was a steady grinding cost, paid mostly by people whose names no one remembers, and we should not leave them out because they were the true majority of the story. There were the dead, the thousands killed by poisoned liquor, by the methanol in the badly made moonshine, by the lead leached from the radiator condensers, by the deadly additives the government itself had ordered put into the industrial alcohol, by the simple bad luck of buying the wrong bottle from the wrong man on the wrong night. They died blinded, or convulsing, or simply slipping away, ordinary people who had wanted nothing more than a drink to ease a hard life and had received instead a death sentence they never knew they were buying. There was a particular and horrifying epidemic of paralysis near the end of the era caused by a tainted batch of a patent medicine that desperate drinkers had taken to consuming for its alcohol content. Thousands of people, especially among the poor, left with a permanent, shuffling, ruined gait, a disability that followed them for the rest of their lives, a small forgotten plague born directly of the desperation that the dry law had created. There were the dead of the gang wars, not only the gangsters themselves, who chose their lives, but the bystanders caught in the crossfire, the innocent people who happened to be standing in the wrong street when the cars came through with their guns blazing. There were the families destroyed, the men sent to prison for years for the crime of making or moving a substance that their grandfathers had made and moved without a second thought, the children left fatherless, the small farms and small businesses ruined when their owners were caught and broken by the law. And there was a subtler cost, harder to count, spread thin across the whole society. The slow poisoning of the relationship between a people and its government, the teaching of contempt, the normalization of the bribe and the wink and the lie. Every cost, in the end, fell hardest where it always falls hardest, on the poor who drank the most dangerous liquor in the meanest places, who went to prison while the rich drank their bonded whiskey untouched, who paid in blood and years and ruin for a noble experiment that the comfortable classes experienced mostly as an amusing inconvenience. The Great Dry Crusade had promised more than anything to protect the vulnerable, the battered wife, the hungry child, the ruined drunkard. And in the cold accounting of its actual results, it was the vulnerable who paid its heaviest price. For most of the 1920s, repeal had seemed almost unthinkable. The 18th Amendment was in the Constitution itself, and amending the Constitution required overwhelming majorities, and the dry forces were organized and entrenched and politically fierce. To attack prohibition was to attack motherhood and the church and the flag, or so it could be made to seem. And so even people who privately thought the whole thing a disaster mostly kept their heads down and drank their bathtub gin and assumed that the dry law, whatever its faults, was simply a permanent feature of American life now. But beneath the surface, opinion was shifting, slowly and then all at once, and several great forces were converging to break the dam. The first was simple disillusionment, the steady accumulation of everything we have been describing, the violence and the corruption and the poisonings and the obvious, undeniable, daily demonstrated fact that the law was not working, had never worked, was producing the precise opposite of what it had promised. People had been willing to give the noble experiment a chance. By the end of the decade, the experiment had been running long enough and failing visibly enough that the patience was running out. The second force was the rise of a new and respectable opposition. For years, the only people who opposed prohibition loudly were the drinkers and the bootleggers, easy to dismiss. But as the decade wore on, pillars of the establishment began to turn against it. Wealthy industrialists, civic leaders, the kind of solid, sober, respectable citizens whose opposition could not be waved away. Some of them were genuinely appalled by the lawlessness Prohibition had created. Some had a more self interested motive, and it became one of the great arguments for repeal: the income tax. Before Prohibition, the federal government had drawn a huge share of its revenue from taxes on alcohol. Prohibition had cut off that river of revenue and forced the government to lean ever harder on the income tax to make up the difference. Bring back legal liquor, the argument ran, and you could tax it again and ease the burden on everyone else. An argument that appealed powerfully to exactly the wealthy taxpayers whose support any repeal movement would need. And then came the third force, the decisive one, which swept everything before it: the Great Depression. When the economy collapsed at the end of 1929 and the long agony of the 1930s began, the entire argument changed shape. Suddenly, the case for repeal was no longer just about freedom or corruption or the failure of a noble experiment. It was about jobs and money and the desperate need of a wrecked nation for any source of relief at all. Legalize liquor, the argument now went, and you would put hundreds of thousands of people back to work in the breweries, the distilleries, the vineyards, the bars, the trucking, the whole vast legitimate industry that Prohibition had destroyed. And you would generate desperately needed tax revenue for governments that were going broke trying to feed the unemployed. In the depths of the worst economic catastrophe in the nation's history, the abstract moral argument for a dry America simply could not compete with the concrete, urgent, human argument for jobs and revenue and relief. The Depression did what a decade of gang violence and poisoned liquor had not quite managed to do. It made repeal not just acceptable, but necessary. And so it came at last, the thing that had seemed impossible: the unwinding of the great experiment, the reversal of the constitutional command, the return of the legal drink. The man who carried it across the finish line was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who made the promise of repeal a part of his campaign for the presidency in 1932, reading the national mood with his usual shrewdness, understanding that a country in despair wanted its beer back and its breweries reopened and a little ordinary pleasure restored to lives that had grown unbearably hard. He won in a landslide, and one of the very first things the new administration did, even before the constitutional process of full repeal could grind to its conclusion, was to push through a law legalizing beer of modest strength, a quick, popular, deliberately cheerful first step. When that beer became legal in the spring of 1933, the celebrations were extraordinary. Crowds gathered outside the breweries through the night, waiting for the first legal kegs in 13 years, and the song that came to be associated with the moment, the bright defiant promise that happy days were here again, captured exactly the giddy relief of a nation that felt it had been let out of a long and dreary confinement. The full and formal end came later that year. The repeal of Prohibition required its own constitutional amendment. The 21st Amendment, the only amendment in the entire history of the United States ever passed for the sole purpose of repealing a previous one. It moved through the states with remarkable speed, ratified not by the usual state legislatures, but by special conventions called for the purpose. The dry forces who had once seemed so invincible, now swept aside almost contemptuously by a nation that had simply had enough. And on a December day in 1933, the final state cast the deciding vote, and the 18th Amendment, that strange and earnest, catastrophic experiment in legislating the national thirst out of existence, was struck from the Constitution, dead after just under 14 years. The president marked the occasion with a quiet observation that the time had come to end a great national mistake, and perhaps to raise at last a perfectly legal glass. For the bootleggers, the moment was a peculiar one, a kind of victory that was also, for many of them, a kind of catastrophe. The thing they had built their fortunes and their lives upon had vanished overnight. The forbidden river of money that had flowed so richly for 13 years suddenly ran dry, not because anyone had stopped it, but because the want it served could now be satisfied legally, cheaply, openly, by anyone with a license and a shop. The great speakeasies became ordinary bars, or closed. The rum-runners hauled their fast boats out of the water and looked for other work. The moonshiners, those of them who could not compete with cheap legal whiskey, drifted back toward the margins. And the men who had built the great criminal syndicates faced the cleverest challenge of all, for they had assembled vast organizations of muscle and money and corruption that now had no central business to run, and they did not simply disband those organizations. They turned them instead toward gambling and narcotics and labor racketeering and 100 other enterprises and organized crime in America, born and fattened in the years of Prohibition, settled in for the long haul as a permanent feature of national life. That, too, was part of the inheritance. When we look back now across the whole strange span of it, the 13 years from the dry midnight of 1920 to the wet December of 1933, what are we really looking at? What did it all mean? And what did it leave behind? It left behind, first of all, a permanent and chastening lesson about the limits of the law, one that we have spent the century since arguing about and have never entirely absorbed. Prohibition was not the work of fools or villains. It was the work of earnest, idealistic, often genuinely good people who looked at the real and terrible damage that alcohol did, and it did do real and terrible damage to families and bodies and lives, and concluded that the answer was simply to forbid it. They were not wrong about the damage. They were wrong about the cure. They discovered at enormous cost that you cannot make a deeply rooted human desire disappear by passing a law against it, that you can only drive it underground, where it grows more dangerous, more profitable, and more corrupting than it ever was in the light. The want does not go away. It only changes hands, from the licensed merchant to the smuggler, from the taxed and regulated to the lawless and the violent. It is a lesson the world has had occasion to relearn again and again in the long centuries since, every time a society has tried to forbid a thing that enough of its people are determined to have. It left behind, more cheerfully, a whole texture of American culture that we still live inside. The cocktail, that art of mixing and masking that flourished because the raw liquor was so often so bad, became a permanent part of how Americans drink. The roar of stock car racing rose directly out of the night roads where the whiskey runners had learned their craft. A different and freer place for women in public social life, the bars and clubs they entered as equals during the speakeasy years and never agreed to leave. Even the institutions of federal law enforcement, the agencies and the techniques and the very idea of a national police power were shaped and strengthened in the long feudal war against the bootlegger. The era poured itself into our music and our movies and our imagination so thoroughly that the very words speakeasy, bootlegger, rum runner, the roaring twenties itself still carry a charge of glamour and danger and forbidden fun that 100 years has not dimmed. And it left behind the people themselves, the real ones beneath the legend. Not the cartoon gangster of the films, but the actual human beings who lived this life. The farmer tending his still in the freezing dark, listening for the revenuers. The boy at the wheel of the Whiskey Six, running the dark mountain road with his lights off and his heart in his throat. The woman behind the bar at the speakeasy, watching the door. The chemist trying to strip the poison out of the industrial alcohol so his customers might live. The cold sailors anchored for weeks out on Rum Row, rolling in the swell and waiting for the contact boats. They were not heroes, most of them, and they were not really villains either. They were ordinary people caught in an extraordinary contradiction, making their living in the wide gray space that opened up when a nation forbade by law what it refused to give up in fact. They broke the law, all of them, every day. And the deepest truth of their story is that the country they broke it in did not really want them to stop, handed them their fortunes and their dangers with one hand while passing the laws against them with the other, drank the liquor they smuggled, and then voted in its public moods to keep that liquor banned. The bootlegger was not an enemy of his society. He was its mirror, its shadow, its secret self, the part of America that wanted what it had told itself it shouldn't have, and found a way in the dark to have it anyway. That, in the end, is what life was really like as a bootlegger. Not the glamour, though there was glamour, not the violence, though there was violence, but the long, strange daily business of serving a thirst that a whole nation pretended not to feel, in the cold and the dark and the constant low hum of danger, one bottle, one boat, one secret door at a time. And so the great drought ends, and the long dry years recede into memory, and the men and women who ran the liquor through the dark of those years slip back into the shadows of history where we found them. The fast boats are rotted away now. The stills have rusted in the hills. The speakeasy doors stand open, or are bricked over, or have become something else entirely. A coffee shop, a bank, a parking lot, with no plaque to mark what once happened behind them. In the warm gold light, in the smoke and the music, in the company of strangers, all keeping the same small, delicious secret. But for a little while tonight, we were there. We stood on the cold deck of a rum-runner under the stars, and we crouched low in a speeding car with the lights off and the law somewhere behind us, and we gave the password at the door and stepped down into the warmth, and we felt, just a little, what it was to live in that strange double world, dry by day, soaked by night, a whole nation winking at its own laws and pouring itself another drink in the dark. Thank you truly for spending this time with me, for letting me carry you back across that 100 years and into those long-gone rooms and roads and waters. It is a quiet privilege, this thing we do together, and I do not take it lightly. If you found something here worth the journey, you already know the small things that help these stories keep going, and I am grateful for every one of you who has done them, more than I can easily say. For now, though, there is nothing left to do but let it all go soft and far away. Let the engines fall silent. Let the music fade down to nothing. Let the cold of those dark roads and dark waters drift off and feel the warmth come back around you, here, now, in the safe and quiet place where you are. The bootleggers have all gone home. The long night is over, and you have nowhere you need to be and nothing you need to do but rest. So rest. Let your thoughts drift loose, the way the smoke once drifted under the speakeasy lights, curling slowly upward and away into the dark. Let the whole strange, beautiful century settle down into stillness around you. There will be other stories on other nights, and I will be here for them, and so, I hope, will you. But that is all for now. Sleep well, sleep deeply, and I will see you again soon in the quiet.